The era of the dinosaur is over. We no longer live in the land before time. The fighters of today are facing the highest levels of competition in history. And guys, there's a lot of fighters that are knocking on the top 5 door. Knocking on the top 5's door. That's right. Guys, might I say, a couple of wins away from GOAT status. And we actually have a couple of fighters active today in the UFC that I believe are a lot closer than most people may be comfortable enough to admit to being the GOAT of the sport. I'm talking about Merab Dvalishvili. I am talking about Ilia Topuria, Alex Pereira, Islam Makhachev. And it seems that we have an arms race for GOAT status in 2025. And I honestly think that these guys, a lot of them, if not already, but they're about to pass the people that would usually be brought up in the conventional GOAT conversation. The Anderson Silvas, the George St. Pierres, the Mighty Mouses, John Jones as well. And I'm not necessarily saying that they've passed everyone, but I'm really telling you guys, we're going to look at these resumes for a few fighters in the modern era that I am going to make an argument for. If you give them one more good win, 2 more good wins, depending on who they're beating, we're looking at the new GOAT. And when I say there's an arms race, I mean that we could be playing a game of hot potato. We could be playing a game of, we've got Merab, who's the GOAT in December, and then we've got Ilia, who's the GOAT in February. There's going to be a hot potato game of who the GOAT is. And I know some people just can't comprehend that. They're going to be like, whoa, dude, you got to wait till it's all said and done. Resumes don't magically change when it's all said and done. Like, they change based on what has happened most recently, right? And I also think that there are some other sneaky underrated resumes that we're going to talk about as well. I think that this man right here, Petr Yan, is actually knocking on the top 10's door. Knocking on the top 10's door. Yeah. You get the point. But guys, let's talk about these resumes, man. Merab is the bantamweight GOAT. I think it's clear. 99% of MMA fans agree with me. 99% of MMA fans would have agreed with me after his win over Sean O'Malley. Okay? After his win over Umar Nurmagomedov. I'm talking about his second win over Sean O'Malley, that is. 14-2 record. Those 2 losses were the first 2 fights in his entire career. And those are losses that I can really take with a grain of salt because, again, Merab was a tadpole rookie. I think that losing at the very beginning of your career, let alone your first 2 fights, not the worst look. Those are still losses, but we don't weigh those as much as we would losses in the middle of your career, right? So let's look at these wins, though. Let's look at how many wins Merab has. Before we get into the elite wins, Terrion Ware, Brad Katona, Casey Kenny, Gustavo Lopez, John Dodson. That's the first name that is going to stand off the board a little bit. John Dodson is a legit win. That's a pretty good win. Cody Stamen. Those are his early wins. And then Merab has just since then gone on an absolute tear. Marlon Moraes, Jose Aldo. And I know some people are going to say, Aldo's old. Aldo was like 34 years old. Aldo wasn't even as old as Volk was when he broke the 35 curse and won his title back at the age of 36. Aldo was 1 win away from a title fight. I'm not saying that was peak Aldo, but you are not weighing that the same way you would weigh getting a win over a rookie, a tadpole, someone that's totally washed. Like, it's just not the same. That's Aldo at a good point in his career. Petr Yan, who I'm going to talk about, is there's a very strong argument for Petr Yan being a top 10 fighter of all time. And some people are not willing to have that conversation. You better start. Okay? And Yan is the second best bantamweight of all time. I'm going to prove it. Henry Cejudo. And that was a good version of Henry Cejudo. I don't care if Cejudo's a little old. He still looks phenomenal. Sean O'Malley, former bantamweight champion. Used the eye test. Elite win. Umar Nurmagomedov. That win is going to age so unbelievably well. And even if Umar hasn't accomplished that much, he's got a win over Corey Sandhagen. Sean O'Malley again. Corey Sandhagen. Merab has taken out every single who's who in the bantamweight division in the modern era. Okay? Even back to Marlon Moraes, when at one time Marlon Moraes was a scary fighter. He's taken out literally every who's who in the bantamweight division, and he's starting to lap them. Merab Dvalishvili has 2 wins over O'Malley. He's got a win over the next guy up, Umar Nurmagomedov. He's got a win over a longtime staple in the top 5, Sandhagen. He's got a win over craftier, still very good versions of themselves fighters like Jose Aldo and Henry Cejudo. And he's got to win over the second best bantamweight of all time, Petr Yan. What does he have to do to become the GOAT of the sport? Petr Yan a second time. That's a top 10 fighter. Petr Yan on a 3-fight win streak a second time. Lapping the level of competition that he's lapping. If he wins once more after that, I don't care who it's against. I mean, it kind of does matter who it's against, but one more after that, this is the GOAT. Merab is 2 wins away from being the GOAT of the sport. All right? The GOAT of the sport. That would be tying Anderson Silva's 16-fight win streak. And the majority of those wins would be elite wins. Of course, everyone has a long run to the title where they have to beat the Katonas and the Casey Kennys and the Gustavo Lopez's. The majority of his 16-fight win streak in the modern era would come from fighters like Petr Yan, Sean O'Malley, Umar, Cejudo, Aldo, Sandhagen. You could not top this. You just could not. And it's just not about title wins. We're not even getting into that discussion today, all right? We're not even getting into that discussion. Let's talk about Alex Pereira. I actually think he's closer than most people think to GOAT status as well. And I actually think there's an argument to be made for him being the second best light heavyweight of all time. And a lot of people right off the bat are going to say, whoa, man, way too soon. Daniel Cormier, bro. Listen, DC, I'm going to compare his resume in a second. Alex Pereira, after beating Magomed Ankalaev, before he beat Magomed Ankalaev, before he ever fought Magomed in the first place, I said that this was a top 10 fighter of all time. Since then, he's beat Magomed. He's 1-1 with him. That's an elite win. That's a guy that hadn't been beaten for like 10 years. And Alex Pereira, if he moves up to heavyweight and beats John Jones, does that make him the GOAT? Well, it wouldn't be an in-prime version of Jones, which is why that fight fucking sucks. Then people could just say, it's not prime Jones. But if he beats Jones and then Aspinall, he is the GOAT of the sport. 100%. That would not only mean that he would hold a belt in 3 weight classes, but he would have elite wins, multiple elite wins in 3 weight classes. I think if he beats Aspinall, that is a better win than beating John Jones in 2025, given that Aspinall is just a more dangerous fighter who's at the absolute peak of his prime, right? But if he were to beat both Jones and Aspinall, that's what it would take for Pereira to be the GOAT. But where he stands right now, I don't think another light heavyweight win really pulls him away from the pack. I think that for Alex Pereira, who's 38 years old, the way this man would achieve GOAT of the sport status is by moving to heavyweight and winning a 3rd belt, being the first fighter in UFC history to win a 3rd belt against someone as dangerous, as well-rounded as Tom Aspinall. But you've got a freak out here like Merab Dvalishvili. You've got an alien out here who's fighting 5 times a year like Merab. Is that enough? Maybe Alex Pereira's got to get his moment against John Jones as well. So this man might be 1 or 2 wins away, depending on if this guy Merab continues to do what he's doing with the activity that he's having. But either way, I think he's a top 10 fighter of all time right now. And I actually think that he's higher than Daniel Cormier. I mean, of course, I'm going to bring up Cormier because Cormier is talked about as being the second best light heavyweight of all time. And I think the average response to my claim that he's a better all-time fighter than Cormier would probably be met with some criticism. It would probably be met with some pushback because, again, of course, Cormier's done so much in his career, double champ as well. But to kind of help you guys understand why I think Pereira is so high, I feel the need to compare his resume to someone like Daniel Cormier, who is still widely accepted as being someone that's a top 10 fighter of all time. Okay? I think the average MMA fan would say DC is top 10 all time. And I think that they may be a little bit off today. I still think he's a top 20 fighter of all time, but let me make the case. I think Pereira, if you're going to compare him to another one of the GOATs of the heavier weight classes, I think he's past someone like DC. And that goes to show how close he is. That goes to show why it might only take a couple more wins, of course, extraordinary wins against people in the heavyweight division, Jones, like Aspinall, to really allow him to pull away from the pack. But let's actually look at this. Now, of course, a lot of Pereira's strength of resume comes from the fact that he was able to get some great wins at middleweight as well, some quantity at middleweight. But let's just compare these guys on the all-time list in general. Let's talk about elite wins. Let's talk about losses. Pereira's got a win over Magomed Ankalaev. Yuri Prochazka twice. And Yuri Prochazka, those are wins that have aged really, really well. Okay, because Yuri Prochazka, outside of fighting Alex Pereira, has never lost in the UFC. And he's had quite a bit of fights. Think about all of the amazing finishes, all of the amazing fights that Yuri's been a part of. He's not lost a single one of those. Yuri Prochazka has wins over Glover Teixeira, Dominic Reyes, Volkan Ozdemir, Alexander Rakic, Jamal Hill, Khalil Roundtree. Yuri is an unstoppable force at light heavyweight when he's not fighting Alex Pereira. Those are phenomenal wins. Yuri Prochazka has an argument for being a top 5 light heavyweight of all time. So he's got a win over Magomed, one of the most difficult fighters to beat in the history of the light heavyweight division. He's got 2 wins over Yuri. He's got a win over a former champion and defending champion, Jan Blachowicz, who had 2 title wins. That is an amazing win. Adesanya, a win over him. Former multiple-time middleweight champion with multiple title wins. He's got a win over Sean Strickland, former champion as well, who outside of championship fights has a lot of good wins. And then you got decent wins like Jamal Hill and Khalil Roundtree. Now, why do I say decent? Well, because let's just be honest, since Jamal Hill won the title, he's really just lost. And his resume has fallen off quite a bit. And Khalil Roundtree, even though he's put up some great fights with guys like Pereira and Yuri, he's been losing them. Now, I still look at Khalil Roundtree as an elite level fighter at light heavyweight, but his resume is not that great. Khalil has lost a lot in his career. He doesn't have a lot of big wins outside of the Jamal Hill win. We're looking at Anthony Smith wins. We're looking at a couple of robberies. We're looking at a Dawkins win. However, I am not going to just write these off as other wins, mere quantity wins. Jamal Hill, former champion. That's still a good fighter. Khalil Roundtree, say what you want about his resume, but that's still a solid fighter. I mean, Khalil is a killer. You could just see that with the eye test. And then other wins, Bruno Silva, Andreas Michailidis. He's got 10 wins in the UFC. That's not a whole lot, but if you actually think about it, Daniel Cormier only has 10 wins in the UFC as well. The first thing that people are going to say when they disagree with you for saying Pereira's resume is better than DC's is something to the effect of, oh, Pereira still got a way more work to do. DC did so much more. They both got 10 wins. And actually, Pereira's got more elite wins than Daniel Cormier. The only thing that DC has over Alex Pereira is the fact that his losses are slightly more acceptable. We're talking about John Jones, who resume-wise, on paper, is the GOAT of the sport in most people's eyes. And I think there's still an amazing argument to be made about John Jones still being the GOAT of the sport. And DC lost to him. We're only counting one because the other one, Jones popped, and we don't count that. But the first loss, legit, both fighters in their prime. That is a acceptable loss, more acceptable than losing to Adesanya. Now, still, losing to Adesanya, that's nothing to scoff at. That's not a horrible loss. He's still a phenomenal all-time great. But the Jones loss is more acceptable. Magomed Ankalaev versus Stipe Miocic, despite the fact that Magomed has an all-time win over Alex Pereira, that just makes his resume objectively good as well, on top of the fact that he has a great ratio wins to losses. Losing to Stipe is also not that bad. I mean, Stipe is one of the GOATs. He is a top 20 fighter of all time, top 15 fighter of all time. So, yeah, DC's loss is not as bad. Not that Pereira's losses are bad. These are actually all acceptable losses. But I think it really comes down to the wins. I think Pereira's strength of wins are greater than DC's. Stipe Miocic, that's a great win for DC. That's a really good win. But he's 1-2 to Stipe. Okay? And even though that's an all-time great win, after that, I think that despite the fact that Anthony Johnson and Gustafsson and Henderson are good wins, I think that there's an argument to be made that Yuri Prochazka is better than all of those wins. Yuri Prochazka only has 2 losses, and it's to one person. Every other fight has been a win. Okay? And he's got a good amount of them. Alexander Gustafsson, I've said this in the past, I think he's one of the most overrated fighters in UFC history because people will constantly bring him up as the greatest fighter to never win a belt. And don't get me wrong, from a skill perspective, from a competition in and of itself perspective, sure, because he gave Jones and he gave Daniel Cormier tough fights, but his resume is actually not that strong. He actually has a ton of losses, and his ratio of wins to losses are not great. I mean, this is a guy that was losing to Anthony Smith in his early 30s. This is a guy that in his early to mid 30s was losing to an old man Verdum at heavyweight, where he's supposed to have lighter man skill. He had lost quite a bit in his career. Yuri Prochazka has a better resume. Dan Henderson, great. That's a good win, but Adesanya is a better win. I think Jan Blachowicz is a better win. And then after you get the Anthony Johnson, Gustafsson, Dan Henderson, Stipe win out of the way, where you can compare Magomed Ankalaev, Yuri Prochazka, Jan Blachowicz, Adesanya, Sean Strickland, modern era fighters, it really falls off. Jamal Hill, Khalil Roundtree versus Volkanovski and Anderson Silva on 2 days' notice. Listen, Anderson Silva, all-time great, but that is not a great win for Daniel Cormier just because Anderson Silva, taking a fight on 2 days' notice when he's 41 years old, has absolutely no fucking chance to get a victory there. How is that a good win? A good win is measured by how difficult is it for you to beat this guy? Someone taking a fight on Tuesday's notice when they're 41 years old? Come on. Like, I know Anderson Silva's an all-time great. I just don't count that as an elite win. I'm sorry. I can't. Derek Lewis, what he's saying, man. Derek Lewis, the knockout king, man. Yeah, but he's also got fucking 50% losses, dude. Patrick Cummings, Roy Nelson, Frank Mir. Like, these are good wins. And do you even count Big Knock? Big Knock. The dinosaurs of the Strikeforce era. I'm sorry. I don't even know if we can count Big Knock. All right? Maybe we can, but these just aren't strong wins. They're old, washed up, former champions. Like, but they're old. Frank Mir was an old head. Roy Nelson? Come on, man. What are you saying, man? Roy Nelson came in there with a pot belly, man. Roy Nelson has some pop. Roy Nelson has a pop, dude. Yeah, okay. I think Pereira's resume is better. I'm sorry. People act like DC has like 70 wins in the UFC. Okay? Stipe Miocic, phenomenal. Anthony Johnson, that's a good win, but we're not talking about on the level of Yuri Prochazka or Adesanya. Alexander Gustafsson, dude, Yuri's resume is way better. Adesanya, Strickland has a better resume than Gustafsson. I think Pereira's 2 wins away. I think he's 2 wins away from being the GOAT. All right? We also got to talk about this man right here, Ilia Topuria. With a couple more wins, this guy could be the GOAT of the sport. Again, there's an arms race. We got to see how these other guys do. And if everyone continues to win, like, I guess they all kind of stay in the same position. But the only guys that are getting really booted out are the old heads that are retired. That's kind of who's going to lose in this situation. And this is a point that I want to make. GSP, Jones, Silva, Mighty Mouse, they're retired. They're done. They cannot improve on their resumes. Whereas all of these fighters who are very close to GOAT status already, they're continuing to fight. They're all people that are going to have 4 or 5 more fights, 6, 7 more fights in their career. How are you going to deny that these guys are going to pass the old guard? Can we fucking stop with this? No, man, they got to wait because, you have no freaking, you have no explanation for why they can't pass the old guard. All right? Let's talk about Ilia Topuria. Ilia Topuria is taking the speed run path to GOAT status. Right? He's only got 9 fights in the UFC, and there's only so much of a strong argument you can make for someone that has 9 fights, and that's it. Ilia is going to have to beat the GOATs in order to become the GOAT. And you know what? He's already been doing that. He already has 2 top 10 fighters of all time on his resume. You know, it's so funny. It's like, people say, bro, there's like 80 people in Lucas's top 10. There kind of are, but like, I really think if we narrow it down on my next real GOAT video where I actually rank them, there won't be 80 people. There'll only be 10. But let's look at this resume. Damon Jackson, Ryan Hall, Jai Herbert. I mean, those are whatever wins. Those are the kind of wins that anyone that's had some bit of a career in the UFC has. But then you get to the good wins. Josh Emmett, Bryce Mitchell, Yusuf Salal. These are solid wins. Bryce Mitchell, outside of losing to Topuria, to Gene Silva, to Josh Emmett, has a ton of wins. He's got like 10 wins in the UFC, half of which are against decent levels of opponents. Guys like, again, Said Nurmagomedov, Edson Barbozi, Dan Ige. Bryce Mitchell has a legit record in the UFC. That's a solid winning fighter. It's a good win. Yusuf Salal, rough patch early on in his career, but he's looking like a future champion. Yusuf Salal is an elite level featherweight today. That win has aged phenomenally. And also, we get to the elite wins. Max Holloway, top 10 fighter of all time. Unbelievable resume. Charles Oliveira, after his recent win against Gamrot, that win has only aged even better. All right. People were saying Oliveira's washed up and maybe he's not at his absolute peak. But you know what? Judging by the last performance, that was vintage Oliveira. That was like Oliveira era. Oliveira era. That was Oliveira era Oliveira. Unbelievable version of Oliveira that showed up to beat Gamrot. Since Oliveira's been a rookie, he's got like 2 losses on his resume. Makhachev, Topuria, Arman. That's it. He's got a fuckload of good wins. He's the top 25 fighter of all time. Max Holloway, top 10 fighter of all time. Alexander Volkanovski. Since Volkanovski broke a record and became the first fighter in history to win a belt at the age of 35 and older in the lighter weight classes, and since his win over Diego Lopez has aged well, another unbelievable win. That's a top 5 fighter of all time in Alexander Volkanovski. Ilia Topuria. I don't think Ilia Topuria is going to be able to become the GOAT of the sport with more regular wins in the lightweight division, right? If he beats Justin Gaethje next, that's a great win. It's not making him the GOAT. Whereas if Merab just beats Petr Yan a second time, dude, that could be the second best fighter ever. You may just have to say Merab's number 2 all time right then and there. I think for Ilia Topuria, he's really taking the speed run path. I think he's got to take out Islam Makhachev. He's got to move up and fight one of those guys at welterweight and win a belt. If he can do something like that and become the second, I would say second because I just talked about Alex Pereira, but if Ilia instead of Pereira becomes the only fighter in history to win a belt in 3 weight classes, okay, he's the GOAT with this level of competition. I mean, it's one thing for Pereira to do it against middleweights, light heavyweights, and heavyweights. If Topuria can do it in the best 3 divisions in the UFC, forget about it, right? But that's probably not going to happen. For Ilia to become the GOAT of the sport, realistically, again, maybe it's Makhachev one more time at lightweight, even if Makhachev loses to JDM and drops back down, even though recently he said he's never coming back down. Despite the fact that Makhachev would have a loss on his record there, that doesn't change the fact that Makhachev still has a top 5 fighter resume of all time right now. That is a win that, in my opinion, could be good enough to right then and there say, you know what? Quality over quantity. This is just unbelievable. Like, he is the best fighter of all time. I think Ilia is the best fighter of all time regardless. But the greatest, best resume, I don't know. Maybe that wouldn't even be enough. If he beats Makhachev and he beats Arman Tsarukyan, I think it's without a doubt. This is the greatest fighter of all time. For Makhachev, let's talk about Makhachev because this is another fighter that is very close, if not the second best fighter of all time. So I actually think for Islam, he is the closest to GOAT status, okay? If Islam Makhachev beats JDM at UFC 322, I think he is the GOAT of the sport. I think Makhachev is the closest. Now, again, it's hot potato season, and you've got Merab, who's fighting every other month, and he could just continue to do what he's doing, and he could leave Islam Makhachev in the dust, and he could just blow everyone out of the water and become the GOAT. But for Makhachev, given that he has the next title fight out of all of these guys, I think if he beats JDM, he's the GOAT. And I think people need to get more comfortable with the idea of the GOAT of the sport changing, because ultimately it's about resume. It's not about, oh, well, you know, we got to wait till it's all said and done just because we need to wait to see how we feel about it. No, it's not a feelings thing. It's actually, there's something objective about the way that we determine this. Back in the day, people would say whoever has the most title wins is the GOAT. Why? Because a title win signifies that you're beating good levels of competition. These days, it's harder to get to the belt, and you end up beating title defense level of fighters on the way to the belt, so it's just a little bit different. Right? Back in the day, people started out, they'd make their debut in a title fight. And so, of course, they got 10 wins in a row. They had 10 title defenses. But the point that I'm making here is if Makhachev beats Jack Della Maddalena, resume-wise, no one can compete. Alexander Volkanovski, elite win, top 5 fighter of all time. That win has only aged even better. And think about it like this. We talk about how well Topuria's wins have aged. Max Holloway, since he lost to Ilia, got to win. Oliveira, since the loss, got to win. Volkanovski, since the loss, got to win. It's been the same for Makhachev. Volkanovski, he beat him twice. Since then, Volkanovski, he's beat Yair Rodriguez and he beat Diego Lopez. The Yair fight was right after Islam's first win against Volk. The Diego Lopez fight was after the second win against Volk. Charles Oliveira. Since Islam Makhachev beat Charles Oliveira, wins over Gamrot, wins over Chandler, wins over Beneil Dariush. So that's another unbelievable win that's aged really well. Dustin Poirier. I think there's an argument for Poirier being a top 30 fighter of all time. That's an amazing win. One of the top 30 best fighters ever. Now, we got to talk about it. I don't think you can say that Volkanovski in the rematch was a great win. I honestly give that the same amount of credit as I give DC credit for beating Anderson Silva, 41 years old, on 2 days' notice. And even though Volk wasn't 41 on 2 days' notice, it was a week's notice. He was coming off of an arm surgery. Like, this guy was in a sling. I don't think people understand. Volkanovski was in a sling. He was in an arm sling, okay? You understand what I'm saying? In an arm sling. Fat. Like, actually fat as fuck. The worst kind of weight cut you could ever have as well. So, I'm sorry. Volk had absolutely no chance to win that. I'm not counting that as like an all-time great win. I'm going to count that as a whatever win, okay? Maybe an okay win. But come on, dude. Volk on a fucking week's notice, fat, coming off of an arm surgery. Give me a break if you count that as an all-time great win. It doesn't change the fact that he got an all-time great win against the in-prime version of Alexander Volkanovski that had never lost in the UFC. The first person ever to beat Volk when Volk had lighter man skill moving up a weight class where he had 7 months to prepare. That decision, even though it was competitive, I think Makhachev 4-1'd him. Dude, unbelievable win. Then he's got a lot of other good wins, like Renato Moicano, Dan Hooker, Arman Tsarukyan. Now, the Arman fight, to be fair, Arman's UFC debut on a week's notice, you know, it is what it is. He wasn't fat off the couch. It wasn't 2 days' notice, 41-year-old Anderson Silva, but that's, you know, not a win that I'm going to count as an elite win just because of the version of Arman that it was. But it's a decent win, and it's aged phenomenally well. Bobby Green, Drew Dober, decent wins. Other wins, Thiago Moises, Davey Ramos, Gleison Tibau, Chris Wade, Leon Kuntz. Okay, now we're literally just getting into UFC 5 CPU fighters in career mode. Kajan Johnson, right? And then, of course, he's got the loss to Pantoja, right? Back in the day, he's got that loss as well. But one loss when he himself was a rookie, when he himself was a tadpole, not a bad loss. 15-1, that win-to-loss ratio is unbelievable. If he can get a win over a in-prime JDM who's a champion in the welterweight division, who is extremely skilled, and become a champion in the second weight class against that level of competition in Jack Della Maddalena, who everyone has a tremendous amount of respect for because we just know how good he is, I think that that quality would be unbelievable. The quantity would be unbelievable. 16 wins, tying Anderson Silva's all-time great win streak, but doing it in the lightweight division, adding a welterweight champion onto there in the modern era as well. This would be the greatest fighter of all time. But let's also look at Alexandre Pantoja. This is another fighter that I think is very close to being the GOAT of his division. Now, I don't think Pantoja is nearly as close to being the GOAT of the sport like Merab Dvalishvili, right? But I do think one more win makes him the flyweight GOAT. And again, we have to get past this idea that this guy has to defend his belt 20 times in the modern era. That's just ridiculous. Okay, let's look at these wins. Brandon Moreno twice. Brandon Royval twice. 4 elite wins right there. Then you've got some other really solid wins. Kai Kara France, Steve Ercik, Manel Kape. People forget, man, but that's a fight that people forget. Manel Kape. That is an amazing win. Kaya Sukuda, question mark. I mean, is that really a great win? I don't know. His resume, like, who has he really beat? Maybe you could put that as another win, but Alex Perez, I think if you look at Perez's resume up until he fought Alexander Pantoja, that was a good win at the time. Okay, really good win. And then he's got quantity. Matt Schnell, Wilson Reyes, Yuta Sasaki, Neil Seery, Eric Shelton. We're getting to the CPUs. But He's got some losses as well. Davidson, Figueiredo, Askar Askarov, Dustin Ortiz. But we're going to compare these because I said, in my opinion, I think they're tied right now. I don't think Pantoja is the flyweight GOAT at the moment, but if he beats Joshua Van, 2025 elite level fighter Joshua Van, who just took out elite Brandon Royval, he's the flyweight GOAT. Let's compare these resumes. DJ's elite wins. Cejudo, Benavidez twice. Those are great wins. Pantoja, Moreno twice, Brandon Royval twice. I think Brandon Moreno's resume has aged a lot better since he lost to Pantoja last as well. I mean, think about it. He had that schooling performance over Amir Albazi. He had that win over Steve Ercik as well. And Brandon Moreno, a couple of wins over Davidson Figueiredo, one of the greatest flyweights of all time. Brandon Moreno has a great resume. I actually think the elite wins are pretty similar. I know Cejudo has the double champ status, but I actually think his resume is very similar to Moreno. Good wins. This is where Pantoja pulls ahead. Kai Kara France, Steve Ercik, Manel Kape, Alex Perez versus John Dodson twice and Kyoji Horiguchi. Kyoji Horiguchi making his UFC return soon. Looking forward to that. He actually had a pretty good resume in the UFC. And then you're looking at the other wins. And here's the one thing. I know people are about to freak out about this because you're probably about to hear me say Adriano Moraes is another win. Let me just say this. Adriano Moraes, yes, he beat Demetrius Johnson. That in and of itself is very impressive. Okay. He actually lost his most recent fight in ONE FC. He got KO'd, I believe. And if you look at his record in ONE FC, it's not that impressive. He hasn't beaten that many great fighters. Now, the fact that he beat DJ, it's kind of like Magomed Ankalaev beating Alex Pereira. Okay, you know what? I'll put that in good wins. I'm just not necessarily ready to say Adriano Moraes is an all-time great fighter or as elite as Brandon Moreno or Brandon Royval because, again, this is a guy where even in ONE FC, he's not like the GOAT of ONE FC. But let's get to the other wins. Ali Bugatinov, Chris Carousel, Tim Elliott, Wilson Reyes, Ray Borg, John Moraga, Ian McCall, Miguel Torres, Norifumi Yamamoto. We're getting to the CPUs versus Matt Schnell, Wilson Reyes, Yuta Sasaki, Neil Seary, Eric Shelton, Kajan Johnson. And also, we can't pretend that DJ has no losses. I know that when people think about Demetrius Johnson's UFC career, they think undefeated, never been beat. It's not true. He lost to Cejudo, close fight, fair enough. But he also lost to Dominic Cruz. He lost to Brad Pickett. Yes, very early on in his career, but he also had a draw with Ian McCall. And sure, these are not big losses, a lot of them very early on in his career, but he still has a couple of losses. And he also lost to Adriano Moraes. I don't know why it says 2 fucking losses there. He lost once to Adriano Moraes. Now, here's what I'll say. If Pantoja wins 2 more, it's something you cannot doubt, right? Joshua Van, maybe then you can make the argument, okay, they're tied, neck and neck, even. If he wins 2 more, I don't think there's an argument for DJ being the flyweight GOAT anymore. Okay, let's get on to a couple other fighters. Volk. We're not doing a GOAT video without mentioning Volk, all right? Volkanovski. Since beating Diego Lopez, that win has aged even better. Diego Lopez just beat Gene Silva. Gene Silva was someone that the majority of people picked. We know how good he is using the eye test. How good has that win aged? I think that since Diego Lopez beat Gene Silva, that makes him an elite win. That makes him elite. Before that, you could say, okay, it's a good win. I don't know if you could say elite, all-time great win. Listen, I'm not saying Lopez is an all-time great fighter, but he beat Gene Silva. Outside of his one other loss, which was on short notice to Movsar Evloev, he's taken out a lot of really good fighters. Dan Ige, Brian Ortega, now Gene Silva, right? He knocked out Sadiq Youssef with absolute ease. I mean, Max Holloway 3 times. Come on, man. Come on, bro.
Come on, man. They don't have the money.
That's just insane.
Right.
Like, I actually think the Holloway wins are actually, if anything, underrated. Because Max Holloway is a fucking nightmare for a guy like Volkanovski to have to fight again after again after again. Because think about it like this. Granted, Chin, you can't put him away. Volkanovski, someone that doesn't have absolute dynamite in his hands, you're just not going to be able to get the knockout. You have to win the vast majority of 15 rounds, right? And you don't have to just prove it once. You just proved it once, okay, do it again. On your worst night, Melatonin Gate, do it again. You got to do it twice. That's not enough. Do it again. Oh, you beat Max Holloway twice? He's in his prime? Okay, do it again. This guy was just in that circumstance where the world, the universe was saying, Oh, that's a great win. Max Holloway all-time win. Let's see if he can do it again. No chance to finish this guy. Best volume striker in UFC history, proved by statistics. Most significant strikes landed ever. This guy did it 3 times. You can't fluke that shit, okay? Every single one of those wins is an all-time great win. Diego Lopez. Volk, coming off of 2 brutal KO losses in a row. At the age of 36. Not 35, 36. We talk about how impressive it is to be the first fighter in UFC history to break the 35 curse. Volk did it after 2 KO losses in a row. Since then, Diego Lopez beat Gene Silva, who was 1 win away from a title fight, who has a fuckload of potential, who is extremely skilled and dangerous. Diego Lopez could go on to become a featherweight champion. He probably will. That's going to be like the 145 version of Oliveira. And then you've got Jose Aldo, who was on a 2-fight win streak when Volk beat him. Years before Aldo went on a streak and was in a position to be 1 fight away from a title at bantamweight. Volk beat him years before that on a win streak when Aldo was 32 years old. Come on, bro. Then you've got Yair Rodriguez, TKZ, Brian Ortega, Chad Mendes. Yeah, it's nothing. Yeah, just Chad Mendes, man. It's nothing, man. People will talk about McGregor's resume being really good, right? And they'll always mention Chad Mendes. They'll talk about Aldo, by the way. Chad Mendes twice, man. Chad Mendes twice. Those are just regular wins for Volk. Yeah, man. Yair, Chad Mendes. No biggie. Yep. No biggie. Yeah. Oh, and you've also got Brian Ortega, TKZ, Darren Elkins. Darren Elkins is on a 6-fight win streak going into that one. And then you've got other ones, man. What do you know about Jeremy Kennedy, Shane Young, Mizuto Haruto? In fact, real hardcores know this. What do you know about Yusuke Kasuya? Up a weight class, 155. Yeah! No, I'm joking. I'm joking around. Those are throwaway wins, but hey, everyone's got those. Losses. To 2 top 10 fighters of all time that were both discussed in this video because how great the resumes are. One of which is the most statistically permissible loss in UFC history. That is Islam Makhachev on a week's notice, coming off of the couch, fat, off of an arm surgery where Volk was walking around in a fucking sling. I don't even put a grain of salt into that, okay? I don't even have to take that with a grain of salt. I'll take it with a fucking dust particle. All right. Ilia Topuria. All right, I can deal with it. It's not a bad loss. Look at what Ilia is going to go on to do. And that's not to say that Volkanovski is going to pull away from Ilia. If Ilia continues to win, Ilia will always have that over him, right? But still, Islam Makhachev, the first loss, which was legit. That was Volkanovski at his absolute peak. Lighter man skill, improved chin, moving up a weight class. Confidence of an undefeated fighter, right? In his backyard as well. That's a legit loss. Credit to Islam Makhachev. But it's Makhachev, man. That's a top 5 fighter of all time, who I just talked about as being 1 win away from being the GOAT of the fucking sport. That's about to be the new Daniel Cormier loss to John Jones. That's about to be the new loss to John Jones. Where you can say, oh, he lost to Jones, but that's the GOAT. It's not a bad loss. Yeah, he lost to Makhachev. It's not that bad. Volkanovski, in my opinion, is a top 5 fighter of all time right now. Especially strengthened by the fact that he beat Diego Lopez recently. That strengthens it even more. This is a top 5 fighter all time right now. What does he need to do to become the GOAT of the sport? And again, we'll see what happens with Makhachev and JDM. Maybe he loses, right? We'll see what happens with Ilia Topuria's career. We'll see what happens with Merab. But if those guys just chill and stop fighting or maybe lose, whatever, Volkanovski, because we're in an arms race. If everyone continues to win, Volk just has to keep adding more and more and more, like everyone else has to keep adding more and more. But in my opinion, If Volk goes out there in his next fight and beats Movsar Evloev or Lerone Murphy, 2 undefeated fighters on long win streaks, there's no more argument for GSP being higher than him. I don't think anymore you can make an argument for GSP being higher than Volk right now. But if he wins a second title fight at the age of 37, breaking the 35 curse, again, even though the 35 curse is losing its cursiness, right? The point that I'm making here is, if he does that again, top 3 fighter without a doubt. If he wins one more after that, go to the sport. Now again, people are going to be laughing. Well, you just talked about these. Yeah, I know. If Makhachev wins against JDM, Volk has to get 3 more. I understand how it works. I'm just saying we got to talk about how amazing this resume is as well. I'm sorry, but you just can't be bringing up DC or, GSP. Like, even John Jones, if Volk gets 2 more wins, even John Jones can't compete with that anymore. Unless he comes back and fights Alex Pereira and beats him. That kind of thing. But the big point that I want to make here is that Jones, GSP, Mighty, Silva, Aldo, Daniel Cormier, even Khabib is still talked about in these conversations. We have a new top 5. 10 years ago, GSP, Jones, Mighty, these guys were all competing actively, right? They were at these points of their careers. So why would it be any different? Because 10 years ago, that's when the Jones, George St. Pierre, Mighty Mouse, GOAT conversation started. Why is it that we're going to prioritize the guys of the past and allow them to be the GOATs of the sport because of all of the things they had accomplished back then, but these guys can't? Like, it makes no sense to me. You don't get mythical points. Okay, you don't get fucking nostalgia points or mythical points. Oh, well, people that became the GOAT of the sport in the first 20 years of the sport, they automatically cannot be passed. I don't think we should hold a double standard. These guys are achieving what those guys achieved and more. They should be the fucking GOATs. All right, and last but not least, let's talk about my argument for Petr Yan, because I am going to make a GOAT video in the future, and this guy will probably be top 10 if I make it before he loses to Merab, if he does lose to Merab, because I think he will, but if he beats Merab, by the way, he's top 5. If Petr Yan beats Merab, who in my opinion is a top 5 fighter of all time. I know. Oh, bro, it's like 50 top 5 people. No, but like really, Merab is a top 5 fighter of all time right now. If Petr Yan beats Merab, he is a top 5 fighter of all time. He absorbs that resume. This is my argument for my Yan is a top 10 fighter, though. And at the very least, top 15 fighter of all time. Okay? You have to count the Aljamain Sterling first fight as a win. I don't think you can just count that as you can never count that as a loss right off the bat. You do not get to say Aljo has 2 wins over Petr Yan. That's disingenuous. Okay? We don't give someone a win over someone because they are losing a fight for 4 rounds. It'd be one thing if the illegal knee happened in the first round, maybe even the second round. It happened at the end of the 4th round where Yan was up 3-1. He was going to win the 5th. Let's not sit there and act like we can't give this guy credit for beating Aljamain Sterling. Both of those fighters went into that fight and fought for 19 minutes. We saw 2 of the best bantamweights in the world after an entire training camp. There was no short notice bullshit fight for 19 minutes. I am not going to discard that because of one technique. He threw a knee. Now I have to disregard everything I saw. Yan that night proved that he was the best bantamweight on earth in a fucking MMA fight that was cut short at 19 minutes. I agree with the decision to not give him the belt after that. I agree. I understand why the UFC couldn't give Yan the belt. I get it. There has to be some kind of a repercussion, a consequence for doing an illegal move like that. You're no longer the champ. You're no longer getting champ money. You're no longer defending that belt. Great. Okay? I don't have a problem with that. With the way that we look at fighting, we determine how good you are based on how you're performing against other elite fighters. You got to give him credit for that. Okay? Sean O'Malley, that's another controversial one because, again, people are going to make the argument that, yeah, well, if you just give him credit for beating people he lost to, it's disingenuous to suggest that he lost to Aljamain Sterling. It just is. It's not a serious argument. I'm sorry, it's just not. Okay, Sean O'Malley, we have a different conversation. Because some people do think Sean O'Malley won that fight, which is why I have a question mark there. What I think I can say about that is that was how you can kind of look at a draw. I think most people thought Jan won the fight. When I've watched that fight back, I still give Jan the credit. I still think Jan won that fight, and I still think most people would agree with that. But we're not going to just appeal to what most people would think. You have to be as objective as possible. There is a legit argument for O'Malley, even though I don't think it's a very strong one. I'm not going to look at that as a loss. Maybe we can write it off as a draw. So maybe we can change this to 12, 2, and 1. Right? I don't have a problem with that. But let's actually think about it. Outside of Jan's loss to Aljamain Sterling in the rematch, which was a legit loss, and Merab Dvalishvili, who is a top 5 fighter of all time, he's done nothing but win. Jose Aldo, a good version of him, when Aldo was, 33, 34? Aljamain Sterling, top 5 bantamweight of all time. Davidson Figueiredo, solid win. Former flyweight champion. He was on a 3-fight win streak, on the verge of getting a title fight. At the time, that was an amazing win. Corey Sandhagen, prime Sandhagen as well. Amazing win for Petr Yan. Song Yadong, that is a staple in the top 10 bantamweight division in the modern era. Song Yadong will continue to be a staple in the top 10 in the bantamweight division for a while. And then Sean O'Malley, maybe you count that as a draw, whatever. He's also got other good wins like Marcus McGee, Jimmy Rivera, John Dodson. Those are decent wins. Uriah Faber, Douglas Silva de Andrade, Jinsu Sun, Teruto Ishihara. Okay, whatever. Those are throwaway wins. Uriah Faber. I think that this is the second best bantamweight of all time. I think that Petr Yan objectively has a better resume than Dominic Cruz. Sandhagen, Sterling, Aldo, Figgy, Song Yadong. You got to at least admit this guy's top 15 of all time with this resume. All right? You've got to at least admit he's top 15. But if this guy beats Merab, that is a top 5 fighter of all time right now in the modern era, on the verge of GOAT status. If Yan wins that rematch, we're off to the races. Petr Yan is in the top 10. And he is knocking on top 5 door. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Until next time.